Hello and welcome to Discussability, a podcast focusing on community education and storytelling around disability. We are your hosts, Macdonald Metzger, and
Chilaka.
we create accessible, inclusive content for the general public. Discussion topics include current events in disability, lived experiences, policies, and resources.
Hello, listeners out there in the podcast realm. I am your host, Chilaka.
And I'm your host, Macdonald Metzger, and welcome to Discussability. Get in the know. Today we have two wonderful guests with us, and we'll be having some really interesting discussions about various disability topics and issues. We'll dig deeper into the realm of disability and explore with these two amazing guests. And we hope you stay with us for this interesting conversation.
That's right, Macdonald. Today we have with us Dr. Heather Feldner and Dr. Heather Evans. Dr. Feldner is an assistant professor and physical therapist within the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Washington. She is a board-certified pediatric clinical specialist and also serves as core faculty in the University of Washington Disability Studies program. Dr. Heather Evans is an assistant professor in rehabilitation medicine at the University of Washington and faculty member of the University of Washington Disability Studies program. Additionally, she is currently the director of research at the Northwest ADA Center.
Feldner and Evans, thank you so much for joining us.
We are so happy to be here. Thank you.
Very delighted. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Sure. While we've heard a little bit about your academic and career background, I'm sure the listeners as well want to hear more about you. What really drove you to the work in this field? What influences your passions? Evans, please go first. What influences your passion?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question and for having us here. I'll start out just sharing a little of my positionality, which is very common in my field, is to let you know what kinds of perspectives and experiences I bring to the research and teaching that I do. So I am a white cisgendered woman. I identify as disabled. And it was about partway through graduate school that I just kept finding myself, regardless of what I studied in sociology. I have a PhD in sociology. And I was interested in just the way that institutions can marginalize certain populations, but also the ways that in which institutions can empower populations. And so that took me, to areas of looking at the criminal justice system, looking at unhoused populations, mental health care. But it just seemed wherever I seemed to look or study, I kept encountering disability stigma in society. And as a disabled person myself, of course, also encountered a variety of barriers traversing through academia and higher education. And, I continue to do research in a lot of different areas. For me, it's really important to do community-based and community-engaged research. So I'm a very applied researcher, which in some academic circles is a dirty word. But it's really important to me that my research really focus on priorities of the communities that I work with and is actually relevant to those communities. So for me, coming to the field of critical disability studies was honestly coming home. It was finding an intellectual home, finding scholars like Dr. Feldner, who had similar interests and passions. And so everything I teach and I research are really grounded in social justice. And disability justice is just one of the avenues that really continue to fuel my passion.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Feldner, what really drove you into this work and what influences your passion?
Yeah, thank you, Macdonald. So like Evans mentioned, I will start with a little bit of my own positionality just because I think it frames what I can bring and also the limitations that I bring to these topics. I am a cisgendered white woman, use she, her pronouns. I do not currently identify as disabled, but I am a parent, as well as a daughter of disabled people in my family. And so, again, that really shapes and limits my understanding of a lot of these topics. And I came to this as a clinician. I came to disability studies as a clinician. So I was trained with a very medical model understanding of disability. And I practiced in the clinic for many, many years full time before moving over into academia. And when I made the switch into academia, I really was looking at two programs. I was looking at a disability studies PhD program, and I was looking at like a maternal and child health PhD, which is more public health related. And I remember meeting with several of the faculty members of both programs as I was trying to make my decision. And I was kind of leaning toward public health, actually, just I think because of my background in my clinical training and rehabilitation, like that had really seemed like the better fit. And I sat down with my would-be advisor in the public health department at the program that I was at UIC. And she asked me, she's like, what are your interests? What are you passionate about studying from a research perspective? You have this clinical experience. What are you looking at? And I started talking to her about all of these disability justice related things. I've seen in my clinical experience that people who use mobility technology are really stigmatized. And I look at this as something that is more, is freeing and is an opportunity to engage in a world that isn't built for them. And she stops me. She's like, Heather, you are speaking so in depth about disability justice. This is not the program for you. You need to pursue this in disability studies to really kind of harness that passion and that interest and that background. And I think there's probably a way that you can still bring your experiences from the clinic and your experiences with technology into this kind of disability studies framework. And I was like, wow, I think you're right. And so really having that one conversation was so formative for me because it brought me to the disability studies program. And really, from there, it has just been this wonderful experience, this very challenging experience at times, right? There's a lot of tension between a traditional rehab model of thinking about disability and more of a disability justice framework. And that was very challenging at times, but it was so liberating at the same time to think about how can I be a better clinician, potentially teach other clinicians to just shift their thinking about the way that we as a society think about disability. And that was really exciting. And that's definitely what's driven me forward. And at a place like University of Washington, it's really wonderful because I get to be a part of the rehab faculty, but I also get to be a part of the disability studies community. And those two things aren't at odds. They're complementary, and we're bridging, as Evans mentioned, and that's been so exciting.
Well, it's also exciting to hear you talk about this. And naturally, we actually just moving into talking more about disability studies itself. So when one looks at how disability studies is defined in research, it says it's a relatively new field of study. It was birthed from the disability civil rights movement around the 1980s. Can you explain in your own words what is disability studies and what it is not? Maybe plain language.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is Feldner speaking. The first thing I thought of when you said that was there's an academic article by a kind of a well-known disability studies scholar named Simi Linton, and the title of this is disability studies / not disability studies. And so in that, I think of that article when I think of this question. But for me, I think in my own words, I would explain disability studies as the kind of academic wing of the disability rights movement, and the disability justice movement, noting that there are, distinctions between disability rights and disability justice. And so I look at, disability studies as a field that really takes a critical approach to understanding what disability means in our society, how people respond to disability, where the locus of the solutions are, whether that's, depending on how you think about disability, that's going to influence how you think about advocacy and problem solving and solution building within disability communities. And so that's kind of the things I think of. I think about accessibility in terms of built environments, but also attitudes, physical social attitudes can be just as much barriers as physical barriers can be, institutional attitudes, things like that. And there's a lot more to it, but I want Evans to have a chance to jump in too. But just kind of that history of discrimination, oppression, that intersectionality, right? In terms of disability and other marginalized identities, right? There's been a lot more attention to that more recently, and disability studies as a field kind of took a little while to get there, in terms of intersectionality too. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Thank you very much. Let's hear Dr. Evans.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great summary. I agree with everything that Feldner just mentioned, and I'll add that Dr. Feldner and I work together in a number of spaces, and so we're used to being referred to as Feldner and Evans. Or the Heathers with multiple S's. So that's part of why we're referring to each other this way. But I think what I would add to Feldner, and some of this is because I'm trained as a sociologist, is for me, disability studies really, it starts at its point at recognizing disability as a socially constructed status, much in the same way that gender, race, nationality, right? These are not physiological, essentialized characteristics. And that means that how those boundaries are drawn, around who's included and who's not included, really depend on the time and place, right? That social construction. Right. And that's why there is these tensions of privilege and stigma and discrimination that flow from that. And so for me, disability is one more status that allows us to begin to understand the way that our society is socially stratified. And, so for me, disability studies, what's implicit there is a critical disability studies. And so like all the other academic fields that approach their object of analysis from that critical standpoint means that as a discipline, we deeply interrogate the contexts in which disability is being defined, how it's being labeled, what flows from those labels. But on the other side of it, I think getting to that, what is it not, is where it's differentiated in my mind from many, when we talk about disability, right, this is one category that cuts across all the other demographic, socially constructed categories. Anybody can be lucky enough to join our ranks at any point in their life. And so, being that kind of category that spans across other categories is critical disability studies is not a field that's about what we think of as traditionally kind of the helping professions. It's really, in critical disability studies, we center the voice and the experience of disabled people themselves, both as researchers, as research subjects, as students, as teachers, etc. And so that does differentiate it. We hear folks are like, I study disability, I'm gonna change the world for, and it's like, whoa, I love your engagement. I love your enthusiasm, but pump your brakes. Who all is involved in the agenda setting? There is that disability rights slogan that is still very much part of critical disability studies, nothing about us without us. And so for me, that is also a key part of what disability studies is.
I wish viewers could see how much head shaking is going on in this discussion right now. And I know that we have a list of questions that we've kind of constructed already. But this is a podcast and we go wherever the spirit moves us. And you brought up a quote that I say in a lot of my episodes, nothing for us without us. And you also talk about critical disability. And usually I've never heard that term. When I think of critical, I hear it in like critical race theory. And for our viewers, could you just explain a little bit what is critical disability studies?
So this is Evans. Maybe I'll start this off and we can pass it to Feldner. Again, critical disability studies I really see as very much drawing on critical feminist studies, critical race studies, critical gender and sexualities studies. And again, what in my mind they all have in common is that critical analysis, again, starts with that interrogation. How did this category come about? What was the historical, political kind of environment in which these categories are developed? But also, what are the larger political consequences of these categories? And here we're talking about power, right? So critical disability studies, we're always going to be talking about power. We're going to be talking about tensions between academic fields, but also tensions between different interests of different stakeholders, right? And so for critical disability studies, it's just to be very explicit about we are not viewing disability as a deficit. We are viewing disability or difference in the way one functions or moves about the world as simply that, as difference, as a variation, in human beings and human functioning. And the critical disability studies always, it keeps us on our toes of, again, reminding us of that intersectional piece of the ways that multiple systems of oppression interlock with each other to both support and sustain each other, but also provide some avenues of how we can begin to dismantle them collectively. I would go as far, and I'm not claiming to represent all disability study scholars here, but I would go as far as to argue that ableism really underpins all other forms of social constructed category marginalization, right? In order for white supremacy to argue that there is a value-based difference in different racial categories, it starts with the argument that there is one superior way of being, whether we're talking about mentally, morally, physically. And that is grounded in ableism, as is misogyny, as is et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to get off too far. I know you have a lot of questions, but critical disability studies, that critical piece means that we are critically engaging with power dynamics. We're recognizing systems of oppression and interlocking systems of oppression, and know that we can't fight one without fighting all of them.
Right.
And this is Feldner. You see why I love working with Evans, because that's the most beautiful way of putting it all together in a thing that I don't feel like I have much to add. But when you asked that original question, Christine, the thing I wrote some words down on a notepad next to my computer: power, privilege, ableism, culture, and pride. And so again, Evans did such a lovely summary of all of the kind of nuances of that critical piece, right? And I think that's something that that's something that she and I are looking into right now, is this kind of experiences of ableism and allyship, and kind of what does that mean for different people? What does that look like for different people with different experiences and different positionalities? And that all ties into that power and privilege discussion, right? Who has the power, who does not, and why? And that involves, I think, another part of critical disability studies is we have to really look back and look back into histories. And I think of something like the bell curve in in statistics, right? And that seems kind of like an innocuous thing, right? But when you start to dig into the critical history of that, that's actually tied to this idea of eugenics and this idea of that kind of optimal being for whatever characteristic that is. And so I think that's the critical piece, right? Is really kind of digging into the roots and the history behind some of the ways that our society conceptualizes disability. And then the other piece for me is really looking at celebrating disability pride and disability culture. And I think that's tied into critical disability studies too, right? Because recognizing that in the midst of this oppressive, discriminatory experience that has been persistent throughout our history, that there have been celebrations, there have been groups that have come together because of their label, their perceived status by society, and that has created this immense, rich culture that has launched into the arts, that has launched into social justice, but that also has really been subversive in a way, in chipping away at some of those institutionalized discriminatory practices, that sort of thing. And so that's the other piece that I think about with critical disability studies as well.
Yeah, I mean, there you have it, listeners. We are getting into the nitty-gritty. You all better have your seatbelts on because we're going for a ride, right? White supremacy, eugenics. We're talking about it all here. Go ahead, Macdonald.
Well, I'd like to know, since I have you, Feldner, like, what does the future look like for this, for disability studies, critical disability studies? What is your vision of what that future looks like? What is your hopes and dreams? Where do you see this going?
Wow, that is such an amazing question. And I think I'll share a story because I think that highlights, I think, where I would like to see the vision for this field. So I have had kind of different experiences in my my journey, right, from like a strong clinical background into a more disability studies academically focused background, and that has brought together a lot of really neat disciplines and intersections in terms of people I've gotten to work with, different professional disciplines that I've gotten to work with. And I have had experiences in the past where I have been told flat out, you have to pick one or the other. You can't do both because there's too much tension. They're too philosophically different. You either have to do this rehab medical model path, or you have to do this disability studies, political relational model, social model path. And I kind of pushed back on that a little bit. I said, I don't know isn't that the point, is that we start to bring these different fields of learning and different lived experiences together so that we can think about how to improve people's lives in the future, right? And so I've had that kind of experience. And then more recently, here at University of Washington, I've had the complete opposite experience. I've had, my administrators in rehabilitation medicine say to both of us, we are so glad that you are in this field and that you're bridging these tensions and bridging these opportunities. And we really see this as an opportunity to think about, how do we conduct healthcare, for example, in a more inclusive way? How do we re-envision assistive technology provision in a way? How do we even design our websites and our physical spaces and our everyday lives in a more inclusive way? And that's where and so to having come from that other experience to this experience where that is welcomed and appreciated, and it's going to be understandably challenging, and I think that's recognized, but having that opportunity to open these conversations across different life experiences, across different professional and academic experiences. I see critical disabilities. I see the future of critical disability studies. I think the momentum is building, and I think the word is getting out, and I see this being, I think there's just so much social justice focus right now, and I think that's a really good thing, to bring those topics and bring those folks who have been labeled with marginalized identities right to the forefront and really amplify their voices. And I think critical disability studies is one of the ways that we can do that, just because again it's so intersectional. And having those conversations and being in those moments of tension is going to help us grow. And I think that's kind of the future, is that this becomes a routine conversation in any discipline. You know, how do we talk about accessibility? How do we talk about disability justice? How do we talk about racial justice? Like, how does all of that combine into what we do as professionals, whether that be academic, whether that be clinical, you know, whether that be industry, you know, whatever the case may be.
So bringing an interdisciplinary approach to this and focusing on all these different aspects, inclusion, design, accessibility. Let me hear what Evans think about that. What is the future for you?
I know. Wow, that is it's fun to think about. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Feldner just mentioned. I guess what I would add, and I think this is part of the future of the discipline. Maybe this is also part of my personal agenda, but what I would say is, I think part of the future too is I see this discipline as a concrete way to get more disabled people into positions of power. And I'll just be, really frank with you. When I probably 10 years ago, I was all about, it's about education. If everybody understood, if they knew what the law said, no one would be ableist. and there, honestly, there is a part of me, there's, that still thinks that is, actually a large part of me that thinks that's absolutely critical. It's essential. We need more education. But really, I think to make systemic change, we need to get people in power. I mean, that's the nothing about us without us, is like, we need a seat at the table making the decisions. And for me, critical disability studies is a way to do that kind of coalition building that Feldner just talked about, of showing again how multiple systems of oppression interlocked with each other, ways we can begin to dismantle that, push back. But it also is about providing the skills, the training, and the education, and having more and more of us make it through the pipeline so that we can help bring people along with us and get them into positions of power. Because I really think that is the key to systemic change.
That's fabulous. And that's actually a perfect transition to my next question. And Dr. Evans, I'll have you answer first, and then we can hear from Dr. Feldner. There is an American scholar named Leonard Davis who specializes in disability studies. He's got this 1999 article in the American Literary History Journal entitled Crips Strike Back, The Rise of Disability Studies. And it talks about the applicability of the field, which you just so eloquently touched on. He argues that rather than disabilities being a specialized field, it should have a more centralized home in education and is applicable to everyone. Do you agree? And if so, what does that look like?
Oh, yeah. You are not going to lure me into disagreeing with Lenny Davis on this podcast. That is not going to happen. I'll tell you, sneaky. I absolutely agree. If anything, what I would take issue with is that disability studies has not just a home in education. It has a home everywhere. It needs to have a home in our public schools, in higher education. It needs to have a home in our businesses and our discussions about employment and economic opportunities. It needs to have a home in our political conversations. I won't take us off on a route of pointing out some of the ableist language that we routinely hear in around election season, and the way that people get characterized if they have any kind of difference physically, cognitively, in terms of information or emotional processing. It just becomes this easy fallback of somehow that discredits a person to have a disability. And so I argue that disability studies really, no, it's not specialized. Again, it cuts across all categories, it cuts across all academic disciplines, and it cuts across all sectors of our lives. So it should be everywhere. I will proselytize disability studies. So yes, I agree with Dr. Davis.
Dr. Feldner.
Lenny Davis was one of my professors in graduate school, actually.
Wow.
So yeah, so I will also strongly agree. But we always used to joke, right? Like amongst our graduate school cohorts when we were at conferences and stuff, we'd be like, "What would the Lenny Davis in your pocket say?" And like, so we consistently have his voice and teachings in our head. But yeah, I agree. I think, disability is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. If we personally don't identify as disabled, we have family or friends or colleagues that are disabled. And, I don't want to oversimplify, right? Because there's just, that point of identity, it is very personal. But it's something that, again, as Evans mentioned, it affects everything. It affects how we build our physical buildings. It's about how we construct education and educational processes. It's about who we elect, right? It's about who gets to have a seat at the table and how big that table is. And whether that table is adjustable for height to accommodate various people, right? And so I think it should be a part of everything. I would also go a step further and say that it still needs to be its own discipline to help tie that together in a broader context. I think I still think that there will always be a need for people to specialize in that to keep that critical piece going, right? Because I don't know that we can expect everyone in every discipline to have the depth.
Right.
But we need to have the breadth. 100% agree.
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, a fabulous background for you both of you knowing Leonard Davis. And I was like, whoa, maybe I should ask that question. But once again, a beautiful transition to our next topic area where we talk a little bit more about language. And this brings in some of the slang that we've heard as well as social media. And so this next question is, when I hear / say the word crip, I feel like I should be washing my mouth off with soap after I say it. But I will say that this comes from someone who does not identify as disabled and rather has a family member with a disability, something our viewers have always heard about. I have a younger sister with a disability, and she really is kind of at the core of my passion for disability advocacy and inclusion. There's this movement about there's a movement around reclaiming language. We see this in race and religious movements, and I assume that disability is no different. Once again, coming from someone who does not have a disability but is rather an ally. And can you two talk about the importance of language when discussing disability? Whoever wants to begin the discussion.
Sure. This is Feldner. I can start. This is something that we talk about routinely, and it's something that we still find ourselves having to practice every single day as well. But language is so powerful, and I think that just as a starting point to acknowledge that the power that language holds is really important, right? And language is also really contested, right? And so, you gave the example of kind of like, oh, I'm not sure if I should say the word crip, right? and earlier on, I had that similar feeling. I'm like, this, first of all, this is not my identity. This is not my
Right.
identity, so I should not be saying it, right? And I do kind of consider even though I'm not disabled, I don't identify as disabled, I now kind of consider myself part of crip culture as an ally and as a scholar. And so that has evolved for me. But I think the power in reclaiming, like you mentioned, right, that idea that this term that was previously used to marginalize people has now been kind of taken back and reclaimed as a source of pride and a source of celebrated identity, right? And so I think that's an example that we try and share. When you see like hashtag Crip the Vote and, the movie Crip Camp, the documentary that came out a couple years ago, right? Like there's power in that reclaiming. And, again, as someone who currently identifies as non-disabled, I am more judicious about when and how I use that language. But I also try and be very explicit about the language I do choose to use and why. And that's something that we do all the time too with other slang, right? Like, not only slang, but even just person first versus identity first.
Yeah.
Right? Like saying person with a disability versus disabled person. In my home field of rehabilitation, 5-10 years ago, we were calling people out for not using person first language, right? Like there was this, like there was just this lack of understanding.
Yes.
There was this lack of knowledge that there was even an alternative that was preferred by people within the disability community, right? And so now when we're giving talks, like we'll very overtly say, like, we're using person first and identity first language to support the preferences of the people that we work with, right? And so you'll hear me very intentionally say disabled person as well as person with disability. And we talk about that
That's amazing.
Work. And we talk about slang too, right? Like all the common, crazy, insane, lame, falling on deaf ears, blinded review, right? All of the words that are kind of tossed around very conversationally, but really have these kind of deep roots in in discrimination. And we talk about alternatives, right? And Evans can jump in on this too, but the other term that I think that is also being reclaimed is MAD, right? MAD pride. And so I don't think that that's happening to my limited understanding with other terms. But that's it's just so powerful, I think. And again, recognizing that this is not going to be an all or nothing thing. We work so hard to use inclusive language, but there's always going to be mistakes, and to kind of gently, call each other into talking about that, and I think is really important.
Before Evans comes in, I wanted to ask quickly: is there a future where there would be some unity in the language, or some harmonization in the language, or people are just free to choose whatever comes? Is there? What does that future look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know, because I think, again, like identity, I think the language that we all choose to use is so steeped in our own identities, and that can be a very collective community thing, but it can also be a very individualized thing. So I don't know that there's ever going to be like one place that we come to with that. I don't know. That's a great question.
Thank you. Evans?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, what to add. Feldner's right. So, I do identify as Crip. That is part of my identity. And so I am much more comfortable with that language. And I will say that, it's been a couple of years now since I've had someone stop me while I'm giving a talk or something and tell me like, oh no, you shouldn't describe yourself as disabled. Gosh. You shouldn't use that word, which, I love, because that's a teaching moment. Nothing to do like, to offer a professor that kind of moment to, oh let me tell you the way. But yeah, getting back to your last question, Macdonald, of like, well, what is that one unifying term moving forward? And I would say point to any group and give me a unifying term that everybody is comfortable with, that they feel like describes their experience or embraces. But I think that disability is in a slightly different place because it is still so heavily stigmatized. There are so many spaces in which to talk about crip pride that I'm greeted with like, well, what? I mean, multiple levels of what? Like, I just used the word crip. I mentioned pride and disability in the same sentence. So, I think that there is still a lot of traction to be gained in the, particularly in the American public's imagination of what the experience of disability is, besides or outside of a different way of functioning. And so for me, the term CRIP is really tapping into not just the shared experiences of encountering barriers in both our built and social environment, but the shared experiences of culture and positivity around encountering those barriers. So, Mia Mingus talks about, for example, access intimacy, which is a kind of intimate sharing and understanding that you develop with others. It's not about having the same access needs so much as knowing a community well enough to ask and to say, we're probably going to have some access needs. Let's do a quick access check-in, anticipating that not everybody is going to be non-disabled when they join a space, and so something like that is a source of just that is a gift, for me, and I'm someone who acquired a disability, and I would say that there are so many things I have gained from this experience, and for a lot of folks that it's hard for them to even begin to imagine, because again, they view this difference from such a deficit perspective. So yeah, it is. Again, we're still having conversations about person first, identity first. It depends on the audience for me of what language I use, what level of familiarity they might be with the different kind of terminology. But, I think what's important is really to emphasize the real consequences that do flow from certain labels. And, we could even get into the utility of diagnoses, for example, and recognize the way that, particularly if we talk about mental health, that having a label can suddenly open access to resources in ways that not having that label will close those doors, but that, stigma and discrimination can also flow from some of those labels. So language is very contested, and I because I've had a chance to peek at questions, I know that we're going to continue talking about some interesting language choice. So I think with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, in the interest of time too, let me bring up another term quickly so we can talk a little bit about it. And I've in the beginning a few years ago when I heard about the word neurodiversity, I was like, what is that? So big of a term, and so sometimes it's very confusing. So on TikTok, the term itself has really grown, and according to the Cleveland Clinic, neurodivergent is a non-medical term that describes people whose brain develops or works differently. The term neurodivergent came from the related term neurodiversity. Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, coined the word neurodiversity in 1998 to recognize that everyone's brains develops in a unique way. Like a person's fingerprint, no two brains, not even those of identical twins, are the same. Not even me and my little baby don't have the same brain. What do you think when you hear neurodivergent? Do you feel like it's another way to order individuals with disabilities?
So this is Evans. Maybe I'll start off on this. Yeah, so the neurodiversity movement, I'd love how well researched all of your questions are. Thank you so much. But yeah, the neurodiversity movement, I think, has been a movement that has gained a lot of traction in our society, and it really pleases me to recognize, again, the naturally occurring diversity in our species. And so for me, neurodiversity is it's not as diluted or generic as saying everyone's different. It is recognizing that there are ways of processing information. There are ways of, we've used the term like brains are wired differently. I'm putting that in scare quotes here. But recognizing that there are large groups of people who share similar experiences in how they process sensory input, right? And so, the other term you don't mention are NTs, or neurotypicals.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And so you've got kind of everybody's familiar with the neurotypical. Right. Again, I would argue that the idea of normal is, again, socially constructed. So when we talk about neurotypical, we're usually talking about expectations of how everybody behaves, interacts, and processes information. And to say that there is neurodiversity within our species and that individuals may identify as being neurodivergent. And to be clear, that's not a synonym, for example, for having autism. Neurodivergent is much broader than that, but it's certainly self-advocates in the autism community that really pushed forward the neurodiversity movement. I don't see it as a way of othering. I see it as the kind of label that allows people to signal to each other, hey, you and I both may not like strobing lights. Great, or a way of, again, doing an access check-in and seeing, can we make this space a more comfortable space for you to fully participate? And so using these kinds of terms, we're not having to talk about diagnoses. You're not having to say, this is what I experienced. You're not having to get into all the specifics, but just to signal, I might have an access need. How can we make this a more inclusive space?
And Dr. Evans, I think you brought up a really good point, and I think is also kind of exposed by this question of the need, at least within American culture, to put folks into boxes and to create dichotomies. And so even, as you said, it's a well-researched question, but at the end, it's like, do you feel that others, and that comes from a fault within my own of just being like, okay, how can I put this into a box? There's either neurotypical versus neurodivergent. And so do you feel, so for me, that's the mind I'm coming from. Like, does it other? Because there's only two boxes you could fit in. And so that was an eloquent way to call me out, and I want viewers to hear this, because that is kind of the discussion that we have in here in Discussability. I think that was a great way to explain it. It's really just a way for folks to relate, but also it really talks about how no two brains are the same, and there is so much that you can learn from one another. And by bringing this neurodiversity movement to the forefront, we're able to in some ways, also using air quotes, normalize diversity.
Absolutely, Christine. And I really appreciate that, because this is why I love this community, and talking to allies and talking to disabled people, is because we're all actively learning. I mean, I've already learned from Feldner and you, Macdonald, this morning. And so, yeah, these conversations, it's not about getting it right, right? That is not the goal. The goal is about creating space for all of us to participate and contribute in the ways we can. So I just thank you for being such a gracious host. I really appreciate that.
And so let's continue on to the next set of questions. And we're so lucky to be with both of you, and both of you being in rehabilitation medicine. And something I don't even know if my viewers know, because I never introduced myself as a doctor, but I also am in rehabilitation medicine and a first year resident at University of Washington. And so very excited to have these guests on in that way as well. But medicine and disability have a rich and rough history and relationship. The medical model of disability typically focuses on a cure and a way to push someone towards normalcy as much as possible. How do you feel that specifically rehabilitation medicine reinforces that idea, that model? And then also because Dr. Feldner, you talked about this for specifically working at the University of Washington, and that's also one of the reasons why I chose University of Washington for my training, is just me really having this love for disability and rehabilitation medicine and being told that I don't know if they can connect, but like it doesn't make sense that they don't connect. And so one of the ways that the University of Washington disrupts the medical model of disability, and Dr. Feldner, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah. I love this question. And I love that, again, we're just among kindred spirits here. Great. I think what we're doing right now is one of the ways that we're disrupting that line of thinking, right? That is so powerful. And I think that that's something that so many people in so many different processes of their professional education or their professional lives, right, can do and can learn from just having a conversation about this and about where we think these things come from. That's just so powerful to me. So again, super excited that this is happening. In terms of rehab in general, we're not there yet. We are still very soundly in that kind of medical model point of view. And you have some argument from folks, right? Like, oh, well, now we have the ICF, which is the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, right? And it breaks things down into 5 different categories. You've got body structures and functions, you've got activities, you've got participation, and then personal and environmental factors. And that's great, right? Like that kind of brings that kind of biopsychosocial approach to healthcare and medicine and rehabilitation. But if you look at how we practice, we're still very solidly in that body structures and functions realm. We're still very solidly in that deficit model thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think there are pockets of progress, right? We're seeing some really positive changes, and we're seeing people ask for education in this area, which I think is a huge leap from where we were even 5-10 years ago. And we have a long way to go, but what I love about being able to be here at UW is again, we have support and we have recognition. We have recognition from our administrators that this is an important space to engage in, right? We have support for the research work that we do, for the outreach and community engagement that we do. We need to be a lot better about recruiting students with disability. We need to be a lot better about recruiting students with a variety of intersectional backgrounds. And by that's when we're going to achieve what Evans mentioned earlier, which is getting folks who have been typically marginalized in positions of power. Mm-hmm. And that's when I think that will change. But I see this momentum happening, which is really, really exciting. And I see buy-in at the administrative levels, and that's what excites me, because it's going to be a chipping away process. It's a constant process of evolving and learning and processing, and amplifying the voices of the people that we work with, and in order to make that happen. But the momentum is building, and it's really exciting to see that, even though we can also recognize simultaneously there's that critical piece, right, that we have a long, long way to go, and we still need to be pointing out the history of the field and how it came about, and what that means for people that don't fit into that, quote unquote, optimal or normal, for whatever that might be construed as. We need to look back, as well as we are continuing to push forward here. But it's exciting because the momentum is building, and that's largely due to the work of disability communities, around the world, really.
Events, can you do that on the women?
Oh, it's so intimidating to talk after Feldner. Yeah, so I don't want to be a pretender here. I am not trained in rehabilitation medicine, and so for me, it was it was really fortuitous, but I honestly was surprised. I was like, "Are you punking me that the folks at rehab are going to invite me in?" Um, Based on really just my history of criticizing.
Mm.
You know?
Snaps for you, Dub.
Right.
Snaps for you, Dub.
Right. I was like, wow, they're calling me on it. Of being critical of the medical model and the medical approach that seems to be very, very entrenched in medical education in particular. And so being brought in on small projects to talk about things like, vocational rehabilitation. And, I was brought in initially on a project about looking at accommodations for workplace. And, the conversation was very like, what kind of accommodation? And I was like, whoa, let's back up and let's talk about the risk of disclosure, the social risks, the consequences of disclosing and how you disclose and what you disclose, as well as the accommodation. Like all of that is part of the process. That's part of the dynamic that allows people to stay in their job or not, for example. And so the fact that they actually made room for me and invited me in, again, I keep waiting, like, are they going to figure out that I'm not really a rehab person? But it's given me this opportunity to more closely work with a number of folks, including Dr. Feldner, which has been fantastic. And what I will say about the University of Washington is we've done a couple of small talks. We got a little tiny grant to look at something. And it has just burst open a box of it. Just in the School of Medicine, across all of the disciplines, people are hungry for these conversations. They're hungry to talk about, even if you take cure off the table, we have great treatment possibilities. Why are we having patients not be interested? Why are we not able to really communicate the benefits of some of the healthcare provision, and just bringing in and be like, well, how are we presenting it? Are you going out and saying, oh, you look a little broken, let me help you look a little more like me? Or are you engaging with people and asking, what is it, if you have access to this, what is it you would like to be able to do? I just come back to Feldner commenting about assistive devices and people talking about, and language, for example, being confined to a wheelchair.
Yes.
Whereas like, I have a powered chair, and I'll tell you, that sucker is the coolest thing ever. It allows me to go further faster than I can with just my cane. It's like my car. I've never felt limited by my car. It also allows me to go further faster. And so, just shifting the paradigm in which we have these conversations about enabling people to participate more fully in whatever aspects of life they want. There is so much power and potential in rehabilitation medicine. And I love that the University of Washington is really trying to make space for all of these conversations.
I have to tell you, when I was writing up these questions, this one I kept backspacing because I was like, I don't know what the university is going to think. Are we going to get some emails from the legal department?
If we do, you can send them to me, because I say these things all the time. hdevans@uw.edu. If you want to complain, you can let me know. But I will just weasel my way onto some other committee to try to convince you otherwise. So.
There you have it, UW. If you're listening, it's all Dr. Evans' fault. Okay?
There you go. I'm down with that.
Okay, so you kind of already answered the next question, which was really about medicine and disability reaching symbiosis. And so I'll just go to the next question. In the introduction of the show, the Powerpuff Girls, the professor, he mixes all of these potions and herbs together to create girls. He adds sugar, spice, and everything nice with a little pinch or pour of chemical X, and thus the Powerpuff Girls are born. What are you putting in your cauldron to create the ideal ally? We will let Dr. Feldner go first.
Oh, darn. I was hoping you were going to call on Evan first.
Some big eyes going on.
Yeah. I'm like, oh, wow, this is a great question. Well, first I want to know, what is chemical X, right? Like, and why is that opposed to sugar and spice, right? It's like, let's unpack the gendering. Power.
Oh, that's funny. That's the beauty of chemical X. You don't know. It's for you're free for your imagination.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, and this is something that Evans and I have been working on together. So this is something that we kind of think about a lot in terms of, what's in the secret sauce, right? And so we have a little mnemonic that we have written about, and that is TRAC, TRAC. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of like, what's that, what's that secret sauce? So the T represents training, right? So finding out more about disability studies, about the history of disability, that sort of thing. Doing an anti-bias training, attending an affinity group, right? So that's the T. The R in that mnemonic is recognition and representation, right? So making sure that disabled people are represented in all discussions and have a seat at that adjustable table that we talked about earlier. And recognizing our everyday ableism that is still very, very pervasive in our society. Let's see, the TRA. So A stands for attendance and action. So getting involved in disability justice events, attending a public lecture, going to a pride event or a performance, disability arts and culture performance. Things like that. Also really simple things, Evans and I joke all the time. We see the Lime scooters. They're just strewn around the city, and they're like covering the ramp entrances, or they're like blocking the sidewalks. And even just like moving that out of the way is a very small action of anti-ableism, right? Like and also just not being a jerk, right? So action can be big and small, right? Mm-hmm. And then the C is calling to account, and so this is both calling in our colleagues and our friends and family, and also calling out when we need to, right? Especially if there's a person in a position of power that could be really engaging in ableist behaviors, or again, other behaviors against marginalized groups that are not, like we need to have the courage to call that out, but also then, more gently call people into having discussions and things like that. So that is definitely part of the secret sauce that we've thought a lot about. Evans, I'm sure you can add a lot more. I got to go first, so I got to share our little mnemonic, but I know your wealth of knowledge will.
No, that's great. I mean, I echo everything, and as Feldner said, this is something that we've talked a lot about and are working on. And I think that, we developed the mnemonic as part of developing kind of a modular training of like, here's some basics, here's some resources. This is a starting point for shifting your paradigm. But I would add to that, when I would make this more personal, even when you ask, I'm going to interpret this as like, literally, what would I want in my allies? And I would say that, the first thing is recognizing that we all have different personalities, different comfort levels. One person is going to be very comfortable, stepping into a conversation mid microaggression and going, whoa, I don't think what you said just now is appropriate. Where for other people, they are never going to feel comfortable doing that, right? And so for me, it's not a checklist. It's not a set of the things you need to do. Again, it's not about always getting it right, whatever that means. What's more important is using the ways that you are comfortable, the skills, using the privileges you have in different spaces to again to be an ally, to support disability justice, to create space or hold space for someone whose voice is being marginalized or whose perspective is not being recognized. And so for me, what's more important is consistency. I think that being an ally does not mean donating, going to a march, or having that moment. It's about making a sustained commitment to recognizing the ways that other groups are marginalized. And again, to recognizing the intersectionality of marginalization. The other piece for me is the not policing. To me, an ally is not someone who goes around and tells people what to say or not say, or what to do or not do. But allyship, it's just as important to recognize when ableism occurs around you. It's just as important to recognize internalized ableism and doing the hard work of just recognizing that we have all been socialized into thinking in these dichotomies, as you brought up, Christine, in these binaries, and to automatically assigning value to any kind of difference. Difference can never just be difference. One has to be more valuable than another, etc. And really doing the work to dismantle that within ourselves, catching ourselves, when we have that thought of going, really, am I that annoyed that somebody is taking a little longer to pay at the grocery store, when clearly that person is taking the time that they need to figure out what they need to do, right? And just taking a breath and a step back and recognizing that we all benefit when multiple perspectives, multiple forms of participation can be included in a space. So for me, the other thing I would say about allyship is as a CRIP, as a disabled person, I often struggle with, I don't necessarily have, say, the energy or stamina to engage in that kind of what is thought of as traditional robust activism. I am not going to spend 12 hours marching. Sorry. That's just not going to happen. And so again, I have that very visceral experience of you participate, you support causes in the ways that you can, but also really recognizing that one of the key ways to sustain any kind of advocacy or activism is self-care. It's self-care and it's community care. So part of being an ally is also making sure, checking in with folks that they're doing what they need to do to sustain the fight. And I guess that's what I would add beyond what Feldner very eloquently laid out for an ally.
Well, thank you so much, Evans and Feldner. There you have it, folks. Doctors Heather Feldner and Heather Evans. Thank you for joining us, and for all you listeners out there in the discussability realm, thank you for allowing a moment of your time to get in the know. This has been an episode of Discussability, and until next time, my name is Macdonald Metzger.
And I'm Christine Chilaka.
Have a very good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest for this show. We will be back with another episode next month. But in the meantime, we want to know, what would you like to discuss this season? Write to us at the email address discussability@gmail.com. That's DISCUSSABILITY @gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 701-888-9224. Again, that's 701-888-9224.
This has been an episode of Discussability, the podcast that gets you in the know about all things disability. You can also find us on Twitter @Discussability and on YouTube. Discussability is produced by Christine Chilaka, Gregory Friedberg, Kenneth Pechtl, and Macdonald Metzger. You can find Discussability on iTunes, Google, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are made available. Music is Around the Bend by Evan Schaefer, used with permission. Thank you for joining us.